Good morning, afternoon, and evening, ladies and gentlemen. The following talk is based upon the assumption that nuclear will form part of the future energy mix for many countries and will therefore require a stable and secure source of uranium raw material supply. My name is Martin Fairclough. I work for the International Atomic Energy Agency as a uranium specialist, and thank you for allowing me to take some of your attention. Throughout this talk, I will focus on several different aspects, and in a general sense, I'll firstly introduce you to what the IAEA does and the things that it does, how they leverage and assist with the subject matter of the talk, which is unconventional uranium resources. Then I'll talk about global uranium resources, production and demand, and then I'll segue into what the talk is about, which is unconventional uranium resources. And I'll talk a little bit about unconventional deposit types and unconventional resource production. So, to start with, for those who are not familiar with the International Atomic Energy Agency, my small part of the agency is called the Uranium Production Cycle Team, and we produce a lot of outputs which are fairly well known around the world. In general, they're considered to be authoritative, objective and reliable information that supports our member states with the characterization and evaluation of uranium resources. Such outputs and activities include those related to uranium resource and statistical data, those related to uranium geology, deposit types, uranium deposit distribution globally, and one of the things that this leads into is things such as undiscovered resource assessment and mineral potential. So moving forward, perhaps some of people's main exposure to the agency has been through our databases. And here's a snapshot of our two databases related to energy fuels. There's UDEPO, World Uranium Deposits Database, and there's THDEPO, which is related to thorium deposits. I won't go into THDEPO anymore, but I'll focus mainly on UDEPO and how it relates to unconventional resources. So UDEPO currently contains 4,500 uranium deposits, including a wide range of grades and tonnages, from very small uneconomic deposits to very large, more well-known currently being mined deposits. It's important to note that UDEPO has no economic connotations, and so it's just a geological database. So other areas that IAEA supports member states in terms of uranium geology and uranium resource publications are shown here on the screen. Some very recent releases there related to world uranium geology and deposit models, thorium resources, undiscovered resource assessments for uranium, as well as other publications such as other thorium publications, deposit type publications such as unconformity related uranium deposits, and probably fairly important to the subject matter of this talk, the geological classification of uranium deposits. And I'll get into that in more detail later on as I talk about unconventional deposit types. Probably one of the more well-known and important agency outputs has been this map, the world distribution of uranium deposits, and accompanying publication. And this map shows the distribution of both conventional and unconventional uranium deposits. And again, I'll go into that in more detail later in the talk. Another activity or project or output that the agency is very well known for is the biennial Red Book, which is a collaborative effort with OECD, Nuclear Energy Agency, NEA, and is now in its 27th edition. And in the next couple of months, we hope to release the 28th edition with OECD NEA. And this is a very important publication. And this is a publication that, because it's been released so many times over the last several decades, it forms a valuable mapping of conventional and unconventional resources through time. So it contains information on statistics for analysis of uranium resources, exploration, production and demand, access, etc., etc., etc. It's important to know that the Red Book is one of many publications on the market, or some publications on the market, that outline world uranium conventional and unconventional resources. The main difference with the joint NEA-IAEA Red Book is that it's the official member state or country viewpoint on uranium resources production and demand, and so presents a unique snapshot of both conventional and unconventional distribution of resources. So, supply, uranium supply, is made up of two major components: resources and production. It's a resource production balance. One particular aspect of uranium resources, perhaps more so than most other commodities, is that uranium resources are very unevenly distributed globally. According to the last 2018 Red Book, Australia has the vast majority of identified uranium resources, followed by Kazakhstan, Canada, and the Russian Federation. Essentially, 15 countries represent 95% of the identified global resource base in the low-cost category. Only 15 countries. The remaining 5% of resources are distributed among another 22 countries. So very heterogeneous distribution of uranium resources. When we look at the production picture, we see similar sorts of patterns, again, very unevenly distributed globally. And here we have Kazakhstan as the #1 producer in the 2018 Red Book, followed by Canada and Australia. And essentially the top producing countries, the top 5 countries, produce about 80% of global uranium. Extremely heterogeneous, as well as along with uranium resources. It's important to note that the focus in uranium has changed from it being a commodity to it being a strategic energy resource. So you can see the potential issues related to this very uneven distribution of both resources and production worldwide. This has prompted many countries to look at domestic production of uranium for the purposes of security of supply. So what about that demand scenario? Again, according to the 2018 Red Book, there's apparently plenty of resources when you look at the production capability and projected production capability of various countries through time. So in 2017, primary production provided about 95% of world uranium requirements, with the excess coming from secondary supply. So this is the high case demand scenario and the low case demand scenario with the upper and lower bars there, red bars. If we then start to look at probably a more reasonable scenario of the actual production capacity, which is 85%, because uranium production has never reached 100% of nameplate capacity through time. We see a slightly different scenario there. So if we look further, you'll see that there is a potential shortage of supply beginning in 2027. If you take into account that not all uranium is actually produced and not all uranium production centers operate anywhere near full capacity. So the consequences of that, in a nutshell, are resources alone do not necessarily mean supply. These producers will have to overcome a number of significant and at times unpredictable issues in bringing new production facilities and resources on stream, including geopolitical and local factors, technical challenges, and legal and regulatory frameworks. So there is a real possibility of supply risk. Because of this, some countries will look to potential domestic sources of supply to mitigate this risk. But as I've just demonstrated to you, very few countries host most of these conventional resources. Very few countries host many of the production facilities. So what does that mean for us? I'll get into that in a little more detail. when I start talking about the possible implications of this potential undersupply. So most of the world's uranium supply at the moment comes from conventional resources, and conventional resources are defined as those with an established history of production where uranium is a primary product or a co-product or an important byproduct, such as in the mining of copper and gold. And it's important to remember that some deposits are conventional, some are unconventional that are mining both copper and gold. In terms of definitions, unconventional resources, which is what we're concerned with here, are defined as very low-grade resources or those from which uranium is only recoverable as a minor byproduct. So byproduct uranium is defined as that which is secondary or an additional product, in contrast to a co-product where one of the several commodities must be extracted to make a mine economic. So byproduct is slightly different from co-product. There are alternative definitions to this, of course. Process engineers, for example, would call byproduct as that which is extracted during primary processing, while co-product is after the fact. Nevertheless, those two definitions are not mutually exclusive. So we've talked about conventional and unconventional uranium resources. What about conventional and unconventional deposit types? So the IAEA classification scheme of deposit types defines 15 types and 50 subtypes. It's rather complex. But nevertheless, within those subtypes and types, some of those are defined as unconventional resources or contain specific deposit examples that are defined as unconventional. And here's a brief outline of what deposits are, or deposit types are considered unconventional by the IAEA, utilizing those definitions from the Red Book that I outlined earlier on. Those in red are the unconventional ones, and include some very interesting examples, which I'll go into in more detail after this slide. But I just wanted to point out the publication shown on the screen there, which outlines this classification detail and particularly unconventional or co- and byproduct uranium resources in detail there. So those deposit types in red, or subtypes in red, examples of these include phosphates, particularly in the USA and Morocco. Morocco has a very high percentage of these unconventional phosphate resources, but other examples around the world include many black shales as well in Morocco and Sweden. And you can see that these are very, very large resources, however, extremely low grade. And just to illustrate that point further, here we have a scatter plot of all the deposits in UDEPO, and you can see there in orange the unconventional uranium deposits highlighted above the rest of the other deposit types in purple or pink there. And it clearly illustrates these relatively high tonnages for relatively low grades of unconventional deposits as befitting the definitions that I outlined earlier. So when we focus on these unconventional resources at a global total level and compare the Red Book with UDEPO, there are some differences, in fact some marked differences. There are reasons behind this. If you look at the most recent Red Book, the total unconventional resource base was over 28 million tonnes of uranium. In UDEPO, it's 47 million tonnes. Why the difference? Well, the difference is simply that UDEPO contains a wide range of historic resources, which are not necessarily JORC or any other scheme compliant. It contains a lot more of these highly unconventional phosphates and black shales. So the reality is probably somewhere between the two, 28 million tonnes and 47 million tonnes. The main point I'd like to make here is that the quantity of unconventional resources is very, very large indeed. So the potential for these unconventional resources is an extremely significant one. I would also point out, as I will emphasize later on, that the distribution of these unconventional resources is quite different from the conventional resources that I showed earlier. So, unconventional resource production. At the moment, production from unconventional resources varies yearly between 5 and 10% of global uranium production. As of 2020, uranium produced in conjunction with other metals has accounted for over 10% of historical world uranium production. in the order of 300,000 tonnes out of a total produced of approximately 3 million tonnes of uranium historically. And most of this production has been in association with gold, copper, and uranium vanadium deposits. So through time, you can see the variation in how these unconventional resource production has been distributed. And you can see that historically in South Africa associated with gold deposits in bits, and more recently associated with copper deposits, such as Olympic Dam in green there. To tease out more detail in this historic production, some of this production has been from other byproducts of copper, such as in Bingham Canyon and Twin Buttes. I've already mentioned Olympic Dam, but also in association with carbonatite-related deposits, Palabora in South Africa, and some unusual production related to coal, lignite, and other phosphates and shales. So if we look at in more detail at these unconventional resources, not only are they extremely large resources, but there's an interesting aspect to them. So you can see the different unconventional resource types and subtypes on the left of the screen there, and the total resources in your depot are very, very large. It's slightly updated from the previous slides. That's around 50 million tonnes now, and very low grades, as I pointed out. And there are over 400 unconventional uranium deposits in our UDEPO database. But what's very important to note is that these are the deposits that have had uranium identified, and often there are many, many more deposits of these particular types or subtypes that are only being examined from the other product point of view, such as copper and gold. So if we look at an example of this using phosphates, these are the phosphate deposits in UDEPO. I think just over 100 or so, around 100 approximately. Reasonably heterogeneous distribution, but not too bad. But then when we look and compare these phosphates in UDEPO with known uranium components to them, with all known phosphates worldwide, of which there are well over 1,000, most of which the content of uranium has never really been examined. You can see that there is an order of magnitude 10 times more deposits of that particular subtype, which could potentially contain elevated uranium and could potentially be sources of unconventional uranium. Finally, I'd like to finish off with another form of unconventional uranium deposits and potential uranium resources for the future, what are called loosely anthropogenic unconventional resources. This is a category of mineral resources, not just uranium, that has been attracting interest in recent years, and there are those that are to be derived from recycling of anthropogenic resources, and in particular, of interest to us, remining of mine waste through comprehensive extraction. So this is seen through the eyes of a lens of striving towards this circular economy, which is very, very popular concept today, particularly in the European Union. So here you can see a subset of data of mine waste throughout Europe as an example of mine waste that has been analysed and is known to contain some level of uranium. But let's make a comparison with all mine waste in that particular database throughout Europe. And you can see that, again, the potential for uranium through a much, much wider range of deposits, or in this case, deposit waste, dumps, and tailings, is potentially very, very much larger. In this context, the agency at the moment has a current project looking at a preliminary inventory and assessment of uranium resources in mine waste, which is due to be released next year. And it includes two very relevant case studies on South Africa and Central Asia, which have a long history of uranium mining, both as conventional and unconventional, but the waste would be the unconventional resources. So essentially, that's all I would like to say to you. I would like to again reiterate some of the messages that for countries that do not have conventional resources, unconventional resources are a potential solution to security of supply during any potential undersupply. and are certainly something that the agency is looking at very, very closely at the moment. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'd particularly like to thank my colleagues listed here that have helped in many aspects of the information presented here. And I'd like to thank you very, very much once again.